The worst thing about the Joe Biden administration. Subtitle, Blood on His Hands. That's the topic of today's Bold and Blunt, and I'm your host, Cheryl Chumley, giving you a Christian conservative look at today's news, politics, culture, and events. We just hit the second anniversary of the failed, utterly disastrous withdrawal of Americans from Afghanistan. And this Joe Biden administration still is refusing to acknowledge it as a failure. They cheer it as if it's some sort of great success on the part of America. That, even though the Gold Star families of the 13 brave, heroic Americans who were killed during this withdrawal, during this failed withdrawal, just testified on Capitol Hill as to Joe Biden's utter lack of compassion for their individual devastations. Before I get into more of that, I want to quickly mention, if you like Bold and Blunt, you may get Bold and Blunt at edify.app, the online platform for your faith-based podcasts, at washingtontimes.com, where you can scroll to the bottom of the page and find the newsletter section. Click on it and find Bold and Blunt with Cheryl Chumley. That's my newsletter. It comes out Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and it contains all the commentaries that I write all day long at the Washington Times, as well as my Tuesday and Thursday Bold and Blunt podcasts. So why not just click on that and subscribe to my newsletter, because then you get everything all in one quick delivery to your email box. But if you just want Bold and Blunt, well, you can go to Real Life Network. That is the online news platform of Pastor Jack Hibbs' church out in California, and they do some great work about tying biblical principles to ongoing modern day culture and news and events in America and around the world. And I'm happy to say that Bold and Blunt is part of their Real Life Network lineup. So be sure and check out that. Not just Bold and Blunt there, but all the great stuff they have going on out there. He is one of the real fearless fighters of the faith and constitutional principles in America. Somebody you really want to pay attention to. But one more quick mention. You can get Bold and Blunt wherever podcasts are offered. That's right. You can just do a Google search, a Bing search, what is that? DuckDuckGo, excuse me, search Bold and Blunt Cheryl Chumley. And if you are a subscriber, look, thank you. Thank you very much for your support for my podcast. It means quite a bit to me. So let's get back to this failed withdrawal, one of Joe Biden's greatest, if not the greatest failure so far. And I know that's a long list, but, you know, if you have a few days to think it over, because it's going to take that long to go through the list of his failures, I think you might arrive at the same conclusion that I have, that this is really his greatest of failures so far. And the fact that he refuses to acknowledge it as a failure, it's just a slap in the face. It's just a slap in the face to the family members of those American heroes who died because of his failure. Listen to this. Listen to one of the Gold Star family members testifying on Capitol Hill at a recent hearing just a few days ago. Very sad, very sad. This is before the House Foreign Affairs Committee, just a few days ago.
But now we want to turn to the families to hear your stories about what happened to your children. And we will go in alphabetical order. And first we will start with the family of Nicole G. And Miss Christy Shamblin will give remarks. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Christy Shamblin, and I'm Sergeant Nicole Leanne G's mom-in-law. Nicole's mom, Becky, is sitting with her in heaven, or she would be here today to tell you about her daughter. Nicole was a proud female Marine. She and countless others like her put on a uniform every day to protect and defend our freedoms. They gave up their own freedoms to ensure a safer, better, more freedom-filled life for the rest of us and our allies. Nicole and the other heroes who evacuated over 120,000 allies did not have any part in starting this war, but they gave their very last breath to see it to the end. Nicole spoke about how very proud she was to be rescuing vulnerable and fearful people. I vividly remember her telling me, "These mothers are throwing their babies over razor wire because they know we will keep them alive." Those men and women in uniforms loved their jobs, and they carried out this humanitarian evacuation in the worst of circumstances. Those victories belong to our troops and the people in uniforms. While those victories belong to the troops, there were failures, and I can count over half a dozen opportunities to stop this tragic ending. Systems we have in place were ignored. Descent cables signed by an unprecedented 23 members or people. Our armed services request for air support. Multiple military personnel saying this is not a good idea. Our snipers asking for permission to engage. Every one of them ignored. These are red flags. Why were they ignored? Please help us answer those questions so we can create positive change. The United States of America will again be called on to evacuate and to rescue vulnerable groups of people. Please help us make positive changes so that we don't have to watch another parent walk through the hell that we are walking through. I like to always tell a story about Nicole. It makes me feel better. So I'm going to end with a story about her. She was a powerhouse. She was physically in the best shape I've ever known a female, 5'1" female to be in. We went hiking with her 5 years before her murder, our family, and my youngest son was about 6 years old at the time. And after we hiked in about 2 miles, he was voicing his discomfort in hiking back. And so Nicole cheerfully piggybacked him back 2 miles, leading the group, always encouraging us to keep going and to stay hydrated. She was always encouraging, and I'd like to encourage you guys to help us finish this. Make sure another family doesn't have to join us.
So if you're Joe Biden about now, right, you're checking your watch. Not just once, twice, 3 times. Right? Because that went on for a couple minutes. And if you're Joe Biden, you have better things to do than to listen to Gold Star families talk about the suffering of their hearts and states of minds because of the failed withdrawal of this administration. If you're Joe Biden, you have better things to do. You have ice cream stores to visit. You have beaches to go to hang out on. But if you're an average American, you listen to this heartbreaking tale and it just tears you up inside because you know that this is your country that did this to its own. And not just its own, but its allies as well. I have with me today a guest who actually was so disheartened by what he heard and saw on the news and heard firsthand from people on the ground about this failed withdrawal, that he had to dig deeper and find out the truth of the matter. Because if you're waiting for Joe Biden to give the truth about this failed withdrawal of his, forget it. It's not going to happen. So we rely on people who actually take the time out of their lives to go and research and dig deep and interview people and talk to people and listen to people and tell their stories. And that's exactly what my guest, James Hasson, did. He wrote a book, Cobbled: The Untold Story of Biden's Fiasco and the American Warriors Who Fought to the End. He co-authored this book, and he's here today to talk a little bit more about what we don't know about this failed withdrawal. We know it was a failure, but do we know in so many different ways how it was a failure and how it actually could have been avoided? James Hasson, thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt. I really appreciate your time.
Hey, it's great to be here, Cheryl. Thank you very much.
So you have a new book out, which is fascinating because you are a first-person account of the Afghanistan withdrawal. Cobbled: The Untold Story of Biden's Fiasco and the American Warriors Who Fought to the End. One of the things that you remark in your book is that the death of the 13 U.S. service members could have easily been prevented. Could you explain that?
Yeah, sure thing. One thing I do want to clarify is that I served in Afghanistan from 2014 to 2015, and then was kind of helping stateside to get interpreters out, but I wasn't on the ground. But
Okay.
I was talking to a lot of folks that were, and that's kind of the genesis of how Kabul started, in terms of Kabul being the book. But to your main question, that was probably the most shocking revelation that my co-author Jerry Dunleavy and I came across while we were writing this book and researching it. We spent a year and a half interviewing hundreds of people and getting our hands on thousands of pages of Pentagon documents. And what I could tell you in terms of why it didn't need to happen, I think there are three different things. And the first is President Biden's decision to abandon Bagram Air Base against the advice of, really the pleas of the military commanders at the time. And there's a lot of talk about Bagram and why it was such a disaster. But one thing that nobody has really spoken about that we reveal in Kabul is that the ISIS suicide bomber was in a prison at Bagram Air Base. And he was released when the Taliban overran Bagram after Joe Biden abandoned it. And 11 days later, he was outside Abbey Gate. But beyond that, there are two other specific things that we revealed in the Pentagon's own words and in their own documents. And the first is that they were absolutely tracking an ISIS cell, and they knew that ISIS posed a very dire threat to the airfield. And 2 days before the attack, the military drew up a targeting package for an ISIS location and sought permission to conduct an airstrike. And the generals on the ground decided that it was, quote, not feasible due to the negative reaction from the Taliban. And the interesting thing about that is that on the 27th, they ended up actually hitting that location to prevent a follow-on attack. And the ISIS operative that they killed was an individual who was responsible for basically facilitating all of kind of the attacks in Kabul. So you have to ask yourself, if we hadn't decided not to strike on the 24th out of fear of what the Taliban might, think or react, then could this have been prevented? But then the final piece is that right before the attack happened, the day before, U.S. military intelligence officers tracked ISIS fighters to a hotel 2 to 3 kilometers from west of the Kabul airfield. And because of the Biden administration's decision, we were relying on the Taliban for our security. And so Major General Chris Donahue, who was in charge of the 82nd Airborne at the time, asked the Taliban to go raid that ISIS location. And, of course, they didn't. And, lo and behold, the next day, there's, the preventable tragedy that we all know about.
Did Joe Biden know about these ISIS players the day before in the hotel room? Was he informed of that?
So that part, the documents don't say. We don't know specifically if he knew that granular level of detail. But what is very obvious is that they knew that ISIS-K was planning to hit the airport. And in fact, it's very interesting. President Biden on the 24th, so 2 days before the attack, spoke about a threat to the airfield from ISIS-K prisoners who who had been released from Bagram. And the reason that's very interesting is that the administration has continually emphasized or declared in the aftermath of the attack that it was not preventable, that they weren't tracking any specific threat, and that there was nothing that could be done. An interesting thing is, though, they have never once named the suicide bomber, which, by our calculation, is the only mass casualty terrorist attack in American history where the American government has not identified the suicide bomber. And his name is Abdul Rahman al-Waghari, and he was captured by the CIA in 2019. And the only conceivable explanation for why the Biden administration will not publicly acknowledge who he was is because it creates a lot of uncomfortable questions for them about where he came from, which is Bagram, and what they knew about him beforehand.
Because then, of course, the administration would be pinned down by even the mainstream media, which was critical of Joe Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan, correct?
Yeah, they absolutely were. It's interesting. For the few weeks that the evacuation was happening, it was refreshing to see a lot of mainstream media reporters really holding the administration's feet to the fire about whether Americans are going to be abandoned, what the plan was, what the risks were, why this wasn't foreseen. But then, the kind of the disappointing aspect of it all was that come August 30th, when the last American plane departed from Kabul, it seemed like the mainstream media's curiosity kind of, departed along with it. And there has been no desire since then to really hold the administration accountable. And that's one of the reasons that we wrote Kabul, is because there's a whole story, not just about the administration's failures, but also about the heroism of the troops on the ground that the American people need to know.
Yes, because it seemed like for a brief moment in time that even the mainstream media was holding this administration's feet to the fire, like you just pointed out. And then shortly after the deaths of the service members, the American service members, the media started saying, well, Donald Trump was the one who wanted the withdrawal, and Donald Trump had put a date on the withdrawal. So what more could Joe Biden have done to prevent these deaths and this debacle, correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely right, and that quickly became a refrain from the Biden administration. It's kind of sickeningly fascinating, I guess you could say, to watch their change in tone about how they described the withdrawal.
Yep.
When they first announced it, and then after the casualties. So when Biden first announced it in April of 2021. They thought that this was going to be kind of this historic achievement. And in fact, Vice President Kamala Harris went to great pains to make sure that everybody knew that she was allegedly the last person in the room with President Biden when he made the decision. But then the moment that it all predictably turned into a disaster, then they started to claim that their hands were tied by the Doha Agreement. And we have a whole chapter in Kabul on the Doha Agreement, and it was a flawed agreement, for sure. But it was also one that came with conditions, and that's important because the agreement negotiated by the Trump administration stated that we would withdraw if the Taliban fulfilled several conditions. And, of course, it was a mistake to trust the Taliban to begin with. But some of those conditions were they can't harbor al-Qaeda, which they continue to do. They can't attack U.S. troops, which they continued to do. And so this narrative from the Biden administration that they had to do this, it just doesn't hold water. And on top of that, Joe Biden himself stated when he made the announcement that he would have made this decision, Doha Agreement or no Doha Agreement. So it's impossible for them not to own this.
You know, this White House administration is more than tone deaf on the failure of the Afghanistan withdrawal and the lack of accountability. But let's talk about the Gold Star families for a moment, because they've come out in recent days as we're dealing with the 2-year anniversary of this failed withdrawal, and they're really critical of Joe Biden. And every time I read a story about one of the Gold Star families or listen to them speak, I think of Joe Biden checking his watch as the bodies are being unloaded, right, onto American soil. Yeah. Did you? How much can you talk about what you know of the Gold Star family's attempts to get real truthful answers from this administration?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. And so we spoke with quite a few of them, the vast majority of them, while we were writing the book and researching the book, and because we wanted to hear and tell their stories. And my co-author Jerry Dunleavy has been stayed in close touch with several of them. He was really kind of the point man of our effort on that front. But what I can tell you is, first of all, you mentioned Biden checking his watch. Every single Gold Star family that we spoke to had a similar story. It wasn't just once or twice. It was every single time a casket came down. And they all had similar experiences in which the president didn't know their children's names, and then immediately switched the topic to his own son. And then when they pressed him to learn the stories, their children's stories, he became very testy and kind of snaps, well, I already do know their stories. But so that was honestly very heartbreaking to just hear and to write about. But specifically to their efforts to get to the truth, that's one thing that we've been trying to pursue, and we're glad that we revealed what we did about the bombing. But they have not been given a straight answer once from this administration, not once. And even when they received kind of a private briefing after they were all informed about the losses of their loved ones, they received a private briefing kind of outlining, according to the administration, what took place that day. It omitted almost all relevant facts and just made it seem like this was just almost like a natural disaster, like a freak of nature. And of course, those communities are very tight knit. As an Afghan veteran myself, I can tell you that. And they immediately started kind of getting pieces, little drips of the full story from others that served alongside their children, and quickly realized that they were not getting told the full truth. And I thank goodness we have Republicans in Congress right now who are pursuing it, because they deserve it.
Everybody, I think, around the world watched those tragic images of the plane rolling down the runway with hundreds of people trying to hold on to the side of it. Talk about some of the other victims of this failed withdrawal, some of their other stories that we need to know about.
Yeah. Once that. My first reaction when you asked that was where to start.
Right.
but I'll be kind of talk about two categories of people, and first is the tens of thousands of Afghan allies that we left behind after we promised them, if they risk their lives, if they risk their families' lives, their children's lives, to serve alongside the United States as interpreters, or as advisors, or as Afghan commandos, that we would honor our commitment and give them a new life in America. And they were completely left behind. And what's interesting about it is that in Kabul, one of the things that we start in the very first chapter, we sort of dig through just Joe Biden's history of, to put it bluntly, being wrong about almost all foreign policy decisions of the last 5 decades. But when he was a brand new senator, he tried to make his mark by insisting that the U.S. had no obligation when Vietnam was coming to an end and Saigon was falling. Joe Biden was the loudest voice in the Senate saying we don't have an obligation to one, and it is a direct quote, to one or 1,001 South Vietnamese, even though they helped us. And that it just eerily foreshadows exactly his approach to Afghanistan. And some of them got out, but many of them didn't. And in the prologue to the book, we tell a minute-by-minute story of an Afghan interpreter and his 4 children who were trying to make it to the gate on the 26th. And the way we know this story is that we talked to the veteran group that was trying to facilitate their evacuation, and we had the entire back and forth. He ended up being permanently wounded in the bombing, and his oldest son was killed. And they're still there to this day. And that, unfortunately, that story isn't unique. But in addition to that, I do want to take a second just to speak about the heroism of the soldiers and Marines, the 19, 20, 21-year-olds who are outside the gates. They saw things that, in the words of their chaplain, no human being should ever have to see. And, for example, each day there were babies trampled underfoot outside of the gates. There were women were throwing themselves on the razor wire to try and kill themselves. They wouldn't have to go back through Taliban checkpoints. They watched Afghan allies get executed in front of their eyes. And through it all, they kept doing everything they could to just save more people. And in one sense, one thing that came up a lot when we spoke to them about their experience was this idea of moral trauma. In that kind of being forced to witness and confront things that, because of the rules of engagement and the decisions that the Biden administration made, they were, essentially powerless to stop, even though they were horrific. And so I wouldn't call them victims at all, but they suffered a lot for this country and for other people. And in Kabul, we try and tell their stories because people need to know.
So more than the tragic images of the hundreds of people trying to hold on to the airplane as it departed, you're saying that some of the stories that are lesser known or maybe not even known that you cover in your book are those of women who were throwing themselves against basically wire in order to try and flee?
It basically, it clarifies the razor wire. If you imagine, kind of that circular, very sharp wire that you see outside of a prison.
Yes.
That was outside of the gates to control the crowds. And there were several instances where women who had been coming through the Taliban checkpoints, because of course the Taliban was now providing the outer security, and the administration described them as, quote, business-like and professional. But while they were coming through those checkpoints, the Taliban had been brutalized and assaulted in all kinds of terrible ways. And there were several instances where they threw themselves on top of the razor wire to try and take their own lives, versus when they realized that they weren't going to be able to get into the airfield because they didn't have a connection to the U.S. government.
And then, of course, we saw in the media in the aftermath that Taliban leadership talking about how nothing would change and how women would still have rights and they would be allowed to go to school and so forth. What does your book, Kabul: The Untold Story of Biden's Fiasco and the American Warriors Who Fought to the End, does your book cover the after effects of what's taken place in Afghanistan because of this botched withdrawal of Joe Biden?
Yeah, we absolutely do. I'm glad you asked. And we've been in touch with people who are still there, including women, and that's really just one of the one of the many tragic outcomes of the kind of the whole fiasco was seeing just that human suffering that is occurring because of politically motivated decisions that didn't take into account any kind of strategic considerations or anything else. But the Biden administration, in the immediate aftermath of the withdrawal, probably like the first few days of September 2021, pitched this narrative that there was basically a kinder, gentler, new Taliban that was going to be taking control, and you'd see Jen Psaki and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan say things like, "Well, if the Taliban wants to have international legitimacy, then they will respect women's rights," and that, in a nutshell, kind of captures just the extreme naivete and amateurism of the administration's whole approach to this withdrawal, because the Taliban is the same Taliban that they were 20 years ago when they were sheltering Osama bin Laden. They haven't stopped. There are actually card-carrying members of Al-Qaeda who are in the Taliban government today. And as part of, the Taliban being who the Taliban are, there are, women cannot go to school anymore. They can't go to public places. In most in most cities, they have to be escorted by a male. And one of the really tragic things is just a few days ago, there was a report that came out showing that suicides of Afghan women have skyrocketed in the past year and a half for what are obviously quite understandable, or not, I don't want to say understandable, but obvious reasons.
Our chat, and I know I've kept you long. I think we're just scratching the surface, but it's just so heartbreaking on so many different levels. I don't even know how to just sum up the stuff you've described, but I assume by reading Kabul: The Untold Story of Biden's Fiasco, your new book that you co-authored, that people will learn even more astonishing, underreported or unreported facts about the withdrawal. And just looking forward, just if we could finish with this one topic, with this one question, looking forward, where do you see this headed? There's not going to be any accountability for the Joe Biden administration. I'm almost certain of that.
One measure of accountability was telling the full truth, and that's what we did in Kabul. And we spent a year and a half doing it. But I am hopeful that the Congressman Michael McCall at the House Foreign Affairs Committee has been very, very deep into this. And in fact, he hired my co-author, Jerry Dunleavy, to run the House Foreign Affairs Committee's Afghanistan investigation after we finished our book, and he got a chance to kind of look at some of our findings. So I have some hopes that there will be at least accountability in the fact that people will know exactly what happened. I'm not hopeful that the Biden administration will force anyone to resign, because that would require them to admit that they made a mistake. And President Biden is all in on pretending that this was somehow a quote-unquote success. But the very least, we could do is to make sure that people know the truth and people honor the 13 service members who died, everyone else who served there. And, to your point, we could talk for 3 hours, and I wouldn't even be able to tell you all of the things that are in Kabul in our book that the American people have just never been told about. And I encourage people to pick it up and give it a read, because it's something that's really, really worth our attention and our memory.
You must have shed tears every day during the research of this book. I mean, just listening to you for the last half hour, it's very difficult, the images that your words bring forth. And I agree. Kabul, the untold story of Biden's fiasco and the American warriors who fought to the end. It's one of those books you just have to read just to get to the truth of the matter, but also just to honor the victims. James Hasson, I want to thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt and for doing the deep research for this historical necessity.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
The book, again, is called Kabul, the Untold Story of Biden's Fiasco and the American Warriors Who Fought to the End. I know that you are going to want to pick up your copy, as I am about to do myself. I want to thank you for listening. Remind you, if you like Bold and Blunt, you may get Bold and Blunt at edify.app, at washingtontimes.com, at Real Life Network, and wherever podcasts are offered, available, ready for you to subscribe to. Thank you again if you are a Bold and Blunt subscriber. And if you're not, I encourage you to actually subscribe to Bold and Blunt so you don't miss any of the great guests that I have, like James Hasson, who wrote this remarkable story. Tune in next time, and in the meanwhile, stay blunt, stay bold.